Hello, my name is Vanessa Maria Graber, and welcome to a special program on PhillyCAM for the People Powered Media Fest. On today's show, Shifting the Narrative, Organizing to End the Crime Beat, we'll be having a conversation with representatives from Free Press, Movement Alliance Project, and the Media Inequality and Change Center to talk about the harmful impact of crime coverage on communities of color in Philadelphia. We'll also talk about their dreams to change the way public safety and justice issues are reported on in the media. So, if you don't know about the People Powered Media Fest, you should definitely check it out. This is a month-long festival at PhillyCAM featuring 4 weeks of programming to celebrate the legacy and build the future of community media and free speech in Philadelphia. We're specifically addressing how media representation, access, and literacy affect our lives together. This year's theme, Building Community Power, uplifts all the ways grassroots media makers, activists, and organizers create collective impact through teamwork across cultures and genres. To that end, let's start off today's conversation by introducing our guests. Tahid Chappelle is the program manager at Free Press, a national media and tech advocacy organization who's working to change the media to transform democracy to realize a just society. He's one of the leaders of the newsroom accountability work in the Shift the Narrative Coalition. He's part of the News Voices Project. Tahid, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Vanessa.
Malav Kununga is a research fellow at the Media Inequality and Change Center at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. He's part of a research team at MIC that explores media framing, content analysis, narratives, and history of media and abolitionist movements. Malav, welcome to the show.
So happy to be here with y'all.
Thank you. Brianna Morgan is the Strategic Alliance Coordinator at Movement Alliance Project and is one of the people leading the narrative power work at MAP. Movement Alliance Project works to build a healthy movement ecosystem where organizations succeed in making transformational social change. Aubrey has a long history organizing and building community power and coalitions in Philadelphia. Aubrey, welcome to the show.
Hey, y'all.
Thank you all for being here. I am going to clean off my glasses. They're getting a little foggy. Let's tell our listeners a little bit about the Shift the Narrative Project. And I myself work at Free Press along with Tahid. I'm the News Voices Director. And for about the last 2 years, we've been working on building a coalition and organizing with folks around the city to rethink the way that we cover crime and public safety issues here in Philadelphia. And the Shift the Narrative Project is building community narrative power to lift up those solutions, to challenge how Philadelphia media covers violence, police, and mass incarceration, and to center our community's needs in the story of what public safety means. Let's talk a little bit about the problem of crime reporting. Tahid, I want to begin with you. Tell us a little bit about your background in working in media and how you came to this work.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. Again, shout out to PhillyCAM for hosting us and having this really important conversation. So I'll keep my comments brief about my journalism background, but I started my journalism career as an audience engagement producer. I worked for several news outlets, most recently the Washington Post and the Philadelphia Inquirer, focused on producing audience and community engagement strategies that expanded newsrooms' digital and social media presence, and trying to get as much journalism out into the communities as possible. I was pulled into what I like to say movement journalism and holding police and the carceral state accountable when I started to learn really about marijuana legalization that was happening in the country back in 2016. I learned how cops and people in positions of power painted marijuana as a dangerous narcotic that led to violent crime, which was not true. How cannabis prohibition primarily targeted Black and brown people, and really how the media influenced public opinion around this plant that was actually a medicine. And so learning how the media influences people, shifts behaviors, and stigmatizes and demonizes Black and brown communities, I was really drawn into trying to change hearts and minds using different facts and research that actually refuted a lot of tough on crime and tough on drug rhetoric that we so often still see today. And so knowing that we see all these inequities that face a lot of Black and brown communities, especially when it comes to what police say, how police narratives paint violent crime and dangerous communities. I was really drawn to the work that the Shift the Narrative Coalition was doing in trying to change people's perception around public safety and really focusing on community members who were on the ground doing the grassroots work, trying to create spaces of safety and really looking at ways that we can talk about public safety in the absence of police and punitive measures that puts people in prisons and jails. And so being able to work on the media side and having journalists move away from having police change the narrative and focus the narrative on community members' perspectives and drawing more attention to actual local solutions that prevent violence, that's what really got me into this work. And so I'm really thankful to be part of this work with the coalition, and I'm looking forward to changing hearts and minds.
Thanks for that overview of your background, because I think it gives context, right? Like why many of us who worked in the newsroom started to notice these problems, and the way issues are framed have then been converted to organizers, right? Trying to co-create solutions with community members to address the problems we're seeing in the newsroom. Last year, you and our colleague Mike Rispoli authored an article for the Needham Lab about ending the crime beat. Can you tell us about the piece? And it kind of like, it really got a lot of shares and a lot of interest on the internet. So it's definitely, at least in the journalism community, a hot button issue. But tell us exactly what you were advocating for.
Yeah, so that Neiman Lab piece really made some waves, and really happy to see how well received it was, especially in the journalism world. For those that haven't read the piece, the Defund the Crime Beat, as it was titled, calls for newsrooms to stop publishing crime stories that continue to center police sourcing and police crafted narratives. It also calls for newsrooms and journalists to transform how they cover public safety in a way that doesn't stigmatize, traumatize, or continue to harm Black people or communities of color. There's an ideal future in news coverage where public safety should be centered around communities most harmed by police violence and actually centering community-led solutions that address violence and incarceration. Crime coverage is typically clickbaity. It's sensational. There's plenty of studies that show that the media overemphasizes crime. The overemphasis of crime makes people feel less safe, and that they are really negatively impacted by the ongoing ways that crime coverage is usually shared and disseminated by journalists, which is usually through a police lens. And so because of this negativity that we often see associated with crime reporting, that really shapes public policy. And that actually makes lawmakers want to be more tough on crime when those are the actual solutions that community members do not want. And so study shows that crime coverage does not make people safe. It does not inform people of solutions that are actually available in their communities. And so what we're trying to address is building community power to change how journalists cover community first approaches to public safety, while disarming police narratives that often say that more punishment is needed when we know community members do not want more punishment.
Vanessa, you're actually muted right now.
Oh, thank you. One of the things that we do at Free Press is we are experts at community listening and information needs assessments. And pretty much never, no matter where we're doing this in different parts of the country, are people asking for more crime reporting, right? It's usually the opposite, where people are pretty upset about the ways in which their communities have been criminalized, how the information is really not that useful. And there's actually no follow-up about a lot of these crimes, especially gun violence and murders. And that's problematic too, because that actually traumatizes some of the families and the victims who are experiencing the stories in real time. And so when it comes to serving the public interest, serving people's community information needs, there's really no evidence that crime reporting, or at least the way that it's done in breaking news format, is actually giving people information that's valuable, that's going to help them navigate their lives. And instead, what people want is more reporting around the root causes of violence, around efforts to combat violence and crime, right? Because they say there's a lot of people in our neighborhood organizing and doing really great work on this. We almost never see that. And also presenting solutions, debates, discussions around how to deal with all of these issues. Aubrey, you're working with communities on building narratives that lead to liberation. Tell us more about what is narrative power and why are these harmful narratives impeding some of our movement building and organizing around abolition?
Thanks for that question. And it's got me reflecting on kind of what set me down the path of doing narrative change work. And I remember I was like a freshman in college, and I got a call from my dad who was letting me know that my younger brother got caught up in a situation with some friends that kind of escalated beyond, what he would have hoped, and ended, with them attempting to rob someone in their home. And we were all just like shocked that, our brother was involved with this. But in the days following his arrest, the local newspaper plastered his mugshot on the front page, him and his friend's mugshot on the front page. And at the time, I did not know it was not legal, not ethical to post a picture of a child's mugshot in any news outlet. So I didn't realize that they were violating certain standards for reporting. But the impact of that story was the folks who lived in the same apartment complex as my brother and his mother. And the landlord did not feel like they wanted this person, my brother, my family, housed in this community anymore. They didn't want that criminal element, in this space. And so they were illegally evicted. And so I think it's really important to be having this conversation about the impact of crime reporting on real families. And so that happened. Several years later, my family is going through another traumatic event, and that is the murder of my older brother, Dominique. And so I was forced to kind of confront the realities of our criminal legal system in the aftermath of this, and found myself navigating a trial and court process that felt very traumatizing for me and my family, who were also grieving this devastating loss. And, the following year, so 2018, I had some space between the actual death of my brother and going through the court process to actually start to heal. And I just remember 2018, that summer, being the beginning of the current gun violence crisis that we're experiencing as a city. And there was a huge flood of news coverage talking about how dangerous North Philly is, Southwest Philly is. And there was a specific moment where there was that shootout in North Philly between police trying to serve a warrant for arrest and the person resisting that and firing back at the cops. And there was so much coverage, just look at this Black person who's heckling the police as they try to evacuate this daycare. The police are so brave and do a difficult job, and these Black people don't care, and they're making their jobs harder. And that was the main story coming out of that moment. And I just remember feeling so angry because a lot of us Black Philly residents were in pain that day. We were scared that day. And it just didn't feel right to me that they were focusing on this moment that, was painting cops as the victim, when really the whole community was impacted and grieving by this moment of violence that the police did not even have the skills to de-escalate. They had to have the DA come and de-escalate. And so this is the why I do this work and think that we have to hold local media makers accountable to telling better stories, more nuanced stories that aren't continuing to vilify Black and brown folks. And, since that time, I've been learning a lot about what are narratives and how does it connect to organizing and what is narrative strategy and what is narrative power. And I wanted to offer this kind of definition of narrative power from folks at Movement for Black Lives. Narrative power for social justice is a framework for social movements to take advantage of political opportunities, to delegitimize hegemonic thinking, to construct narrative interventions, and expand the collective perception of what is socially, economically, and politically possible. A narrative power framework includes narrative analysis, exploring narrative possibilities and opportunities, and actually doing narrative interventions grounded in shared values. And so that is what we're setting out to do. We are a coalition of organizers that are fighting to defund the police, to end youth incarceration, to make sure that Black and brown communities have the resources they need to live their full life. And we're also community watchdogs, tracking what journalists are doing here locally and tracking the impact of the coverage we're seeing on the daily and figuring out a process for changing the standards of reporting within different newsrooms across the city. And this work is so necessary to combat the harmful narratives that are making City Council make certain policy decisions about how they're going to intervene in gun violence crisis. If the salient narrative in most media coverage is that police are not receiving the investment and support that they need, and police keep us safe, then we're going to continue to see policy decisions center police and not community-based interventions on gun violence, not investing in our youth, not investing in our elders. So I've spoken more than maybe I should at the current moment, and I want to hold space for anyone else on the call to react to or join the conversation.
Thank you, Aubrey. I knew you would come with the fire and put it all in context. Everything you said was so on point. And I just want to offer another point because I know that Tahid and maybe Mala, we're from families with immigrants, right? There's a lot of harmful narratives about immigrants where they're often only being portrayed in two ways, either as illegally, as being illegal, right? No human is illegal. I hate to even use that word, but being shown doing illegal things and as criminals or as the model minority, and how those two tropes really hurt the fight for justice and for legal immigration status and for people's rights to be here. And so we can see when there's a pattern of media coverage happening, not just in places like Philadelphia, but on national news and on all these networks where a lot of the content is the same, that people start to repeat these talking points and start to formulate stereotypes and misconceptions about entire communities that are not actually representative of them. And furthermore, these harmful narratives really hurt movements' ability to organize and fight for liberation. Mala, before we end this segment, I wanted to talk to you a little bit because you're our resident researcher. You come with all the data and evidence that we need to make this point. Tell us a little bit about some of the research that you and your colleagues at the Mike Center have done. There's been a couple of studies. There was a large-scale content analysis of 2020's policing and crime and protest coverage and 3 American papers. There was also another study all about narrative and structural change in Philadelphia, where you looked at the history and contemporary function of coalitions and how community center media shifts narrative power in Philly's media ecosystem. Tell us first why you want to research this, right? This is very specific, and it's actually not easy to do. And tell us a little bit about what y'all found.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vanessa. And well, I guess just to say, we're already getting a sense of how rich and deep and important these conversations are with with Aubrey and Tahid's offerings today as well. And just to say that I've also, I come into this work as a researcher at the Media Inequality and Change Center, following decades of different kind of political work as an activist and as an educator and as a media maker, and constantly kind of coming up against the limits of how the communities that I'm involved in and organized with um, are represented and marginalized in their narratives, and how important these movement spaces are for a creation of a collective imagination and knowledge, and certainly when it comes to these issues that we're exploring around policing and urban violence in Philadelphia, there are an enormous array of community-centered solutions and ideas and experiences that are not being taken seriously or are not given the kind of an adequate attention in shaping how we think about these issues and what are the possible collective solutions to them. So my sense is that media is always an important aspect of the work that we do, and that we're not going to get anywhere if we're not going to build a collective form of power that can change things structurally if we don't also manifest our collective power through media. So that's been an important part of how and why we're doing this work at the Mike Center. Our interest is really to look at the sort of intersections writ large of how media is structured and how power relations are structured through media in society, and how movements are using, leveraging, and harnessing power through media as well. And those issues collide in all sorts of different ways. There are prehistories that really matter to how we tell the story of policing and urban violence in Philadelphia. And we're here to kind of elaborate a set of questions that we can tackle collectively. And so the research is not separate from the practical reflection and the organizing experience that a lot of people are bringing to the table in this coalition. So I'll just say very quickly that the Mike Center has authored a 3-city, 3-newspaper content analysis report, just to try to analyze, like, so the amount of courage and determination it requires to put together the type of like mass mobilization and rebellion that we see in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others in the summer of 2020. That all of that collective power that's flooding the streets, and that the amount of commitment that requires, and the ways that does or does not impact how these stories are represented in the media, is something that we should take seriously. If we have this kind of theory of change that media isn't important to this story, then we have to also see, like, well, what is it about the way that we leverage collective power to change those narratives? And that report's really interesting because looking across 3 cities in Philadelphia, with the Inquirer, Louisville, the site of enormous organizing in response to Breonna Taylor's police murder, at the Courier Journal, and in Minneapolis in the Tribune. What we see is that though there might have been a kind of temporary shift in how newsrooms are reporting and framing issues of police violence and unrest and protest, specifically in that kind of cycle of rebellion, that there are perennial problems in how the stories are framed, what sources are used, and the lack of context that goes into why people are mobilizing and expressing their outrage and their dissatisfaction with the criminal justice system writ large. Those longstanding issues might shift a bit in moments of uprising, like we saw a rebellion in 2020, but that there are deeper structural issues that are at play here that we'll have to get to the bottom of. So we can talk more about that, I suppose, in the next segment as well. I'll get muted again.
You would think I haven't done this TV thing for a while, but Thank you to my allies and friends here helping me out. I've been covering movements for a very long time. That's my beat, doing movement journalism. And the reason why journalists get the story wrong a lot of the time is because they don't really know who to talk to. Sometimes I see them doing interviews with like totally random folks or folks who are not actually decision makers, organizers. They haven't built those relationships. People are still always calling me. They want to get connected to people. They want to know what organizations are working on what. And a lot of what we do at Free Press is try to make those connections, right? Like, facilitate these events where community leaders can connect with journalists, forge relationships with them, and better explain the story. I think the other problem is the really fast nature of the news cycle, right? Where you're on deadline, you have to file a story in time for the 5 p.m. news or in time for the daily paper the next day. And these deadlines make it so that you don't have a lot of time to gather all the information you need. Movements are very complex. There's a lot of different factions and people with different agendas. Movements are not monolithic, right? Like there's sometimes we have a common goal, but people want different tactics or strategies being employed. We saw that a lot with a lot of these movements, holding police accountable. And so I think that it's really hard if you're a journalist and you don't have these relationships, you haven't really studied the deep structural problems that cause people to protest, to file a story in less than a day that's going to accurately represent that. And I'm speaking for myself, it's taking me years to truly understand issues around racism and policing, housing, and displacement. You have to become a student of those movements and really do a lot of active listening to understand people's experiences and how it impacts them. And if journalists aren't going to do that work, they're going to get the story wrong. And then, as we have spoken about earlier, getting the story wrong, putting these frames on that have a really negative connotation, taking the police narratives and not questioning them at all is really harmful to these movements' ability to organize and achieve the wins that lead to liberation. So I know that was a mouthful, so we're going to take a break. But when we come back, we'll talk more about the current strategies all of these organizers are taking to shift the narrative. If you're just tuning in, you're watching and listening to a special program, Shifting the Narrative, Organizing to End the Crime Beat for the People Powered Media Fest here on PhillyCAM. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber, and we'll be right back, so stay tuned.
Hello, my name is Joseph Sacramento. I am a senior at the Link High School in Philadelphia. In my class, we are going over the 2020 election between Dr. Mehmet Oz and John Fetterman. These candidates, in my opinion, are both immature, but that's usually the case when it comes to political elections. I dislike Dr. Oz because all of his ads seem like a commercial or a scheme to sell a product or something, when in reality, this senatorial position is very important. It can change the way our community lives. That's why Fetterman would make the better candidate. I like how he lets people speak more in his ads. It makes me feel like if he were to get the position, he would actually listen to people. Fetterman has a plan for an issue that is important to me, which is discrimination against the LGBTQ community. This issue is relatively new in our generation. Not so much new, but finally realized, and has not become a big problem in our society since now that we have people of LGBTQ plus from all over the world. It can be your friends, children, or even coworkers. This community is struggling with securing rights for members to be able to do simple things that anyone can do, such as being able to apply for jobs, being able to have health care, or even being properly addressed because of who they are. We all need to fight for it because the truth is we are all one community, and the people that came before us need to realize that it's real and it will affect our youth and the people that we care about. John Fetterman understands this and says that he will pass an Equality Act that ensures that members of the community will not be discriminated against and denied employment and housing based on their gender identity or sexual orientation. This can help a lot of people find homes and jobs. The candidate that most represents me is Fetterman for his decision to help out the LGBTQ plus community. Thanks for watching.
Welcome back. You're watching PhillyCAM TV. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. We're right in the middle of the People Powered Media Fest, and Free Press, we're happy to participate. We're hosting a program today called Shifting a Narrative, Organizing to End the Crime Beat, and we're featuring members of our coalition from Movement Alliance Project and the Media Inequality and Change Center. And we've been just talking about in the first segment why crime report, all of these narratives hurt our ability to organize and to abolish prisons and end a lot of the harmful policing that's plaguing our communities. In this next segment, I want to talk a little bit about the current work each of these organizations is doing. We are in the middle of a really long project. It started in 2019 when we first were awarded funding by the Independence Public Media Foundation. Shout out to IPMF. They fund PhillyCAM too, right? We gotta plug our funders. And we've been working since then to formulate this coalition, build a strategy, and now we're starting to get into the real work. So I wanted to start with Tahid to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing at Free Press, working with our colleague Cassie Owens. Shout out to Cassie on the newsroom accountability work. But before you tell us all about that, I know that you wanted to respond and react to what Aubrey was talking about, narrative power. So tell us your thoughts, and then tell us a little bit about some of the stuff that you're doing in order to hold journalists and newsrooms accountable.
Thanks, Vanessa. Yeah, I just wanted to briefly respond to Aubriana and all the amazing points that she made when it comes to narrative power, shifting policies, transforming lives. One thing that some of our coalition members within the Shift the Narrative Coalition worked on was the Safety We Can Feel survey, which I think is super important because what it did was it surveyed Philadelphians to ask, in the absence of police, if there were additional resources that could be provided to make neighborhoods safer, what would people want? And I think that survey was really informative on showing that people want more affordable housing. They want more mental health services. They want better education and access to schooling, to public libraries and groceries. These are resources and things that you don't typically see reported consistently across the media, especially when it comes to resources that could help not only make communities feel more safe, but help prevent violence. And so I wholly just recommend that people look up Safety We Can Feel survey and really read into the responses that a lot of Philadelphians are asking for in the absence of punitive measures and more policing and incarceration. Like I mentioned in the segment before that, a lot of community members don't want more crime. They don't want more policing and incarceration. They don't think that is a viable solution in making us safe. But if we can actually help shift media into actually looking at the resources and the programs that people actually want, something like the Safety We Can Feel survey really offers a glimpse into what people actually want. And I think that's something that's worth highlighting. And Aubriana, if you want to talk a little bit more about that survey, you can. But I just wanted to elevate that was such an important survey, and I think people should look into that. We know here at Free Press that, we can't hold newsrooms accountable just by ourselves. We need to build a coalition. And so part of our newsroom strategy is working with journalism affinity groups, the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists, the Asian American Journalism Association Philadelphia chapter, and the National Association of Hispanic Journalists Philadelphia chapter to actually hold newsrooms accountable, not just for harmful news coverage, but also on ongoing failures that we see around diversity, equity, inclusion within the Philadelphia media ecosystem. And so we formed this little newsroom accountability organization, or this coalition called the JOHN Network, which is the Journalism Accountability Watchdog Network. And we're focusing on trying to hold, or rather not just identify, but define what newsroom accountability looks like when there's harmful coverage that negatively impacts Black and Brown communities, when there are ongoing DEI failures, that does not allow community members into the news gathering process, that does not bring more Black and brown journalists into newsrooms to tell our stories, and also defining how we want to help center more community engagement and allow journalists to actually connect deeply with communities that are directly impacted by violence and policing. And so the Journalism Accountability Watchdog Network, I'm excited about, because it is bringing all these affinity groups together to say that newsrooms are not doing enough community engagement. Newsrooms are not inherently structured to actually care about Black and brown communities, and that all needs to change. And so I'm looking forward to bringing on more people who collectively understand that a lot of these newsrooms, one, do not look like the communities that they cover. A lot of these newsrooms are unfortunately not only white owned, but they're also predominantly organized by white journalists. And these journalists do not come from the neighborhoods that are experiencing these types of violences. And that needs to change. And so we're looking at ways to hold newsrooms accountable. We're looking at ways to elevate community perspectives. And we're looking for ways to deeply bridge the gap between journalists and the communities that they need to be developing these stronger relationships with.
Yeah, future plans include doing care sessions with people who are experts in trauma, social work, and therapy, because a lot of community listening is that we do has not really been topic specific. It's like, what's missing from the news media, what stories are not being told. It's very general. But our plan is to do community listening around crime and policing. And that can be really triggering for folks, right? A lot of people have personally experienced going through the justice system. On another show I did for PhillyCAM, one of the lawyers for social equity said 1 in 3 adults in Philadelphia has been through the justice system in some way. And so that's a lot of people. We've all personally experienced, either a family member or a friend having gone through the justice system. Some of our families have been victims of crime. So these are sensitive issues, and we don't want to approach it in the same way that we normally have. So these care sessions are meant to inform our strategy on how to approach the public and have these sensitive conversations. And then we're going to go out into the community and gather that data, do that deep listening, and hopefully make a case for what are the narratives that people in Philly want lifted up and what are their actual public safety information needs. And I think in the future, we hope to take that data and formulate training, content, right, research and analysis around it, to then go back to newsrooms and say, this is actually what communities want. And we're looking to be an advocate for the public always in getting the type of journalism that they deserve, right? And that's not going to harm them. Aubrey, I want you to talk a little bit about the work that y'all are doing at MAP, working with these community organizations and diving into narrative, right? Y'all are students of narrative, I think, right now, learning all about that. Tell us about some of the projects or strategies you're employing in order to address this issue.
Yeah, so narrative change work is like all about shifting what people believe about themselves and the world around them. And, a lot of us who are leading different campaigns related to like the criminal legal system, we find that it's like very difficult. In my last organizing role, I was doing work around defunding the police and decarcerating our prisons and jails. And, for one organization to like go down a path to change policy, to reduce the jail population, like you're confronting narratives that, oh, if you're in jail, it's because you did something wrong and the cops have enough proof to arrest you and incarcerate you. That the only way to feel safe is to have a robust militarized police department. But it is really hard for a single organization to actually get majority of Philadelphians to believe that that's actually a lie, that is not true, that majority of people down on State Road sitting in jail have not been actually convicted. They're in jail because they are poor. They cannot post bail. And, the last data that we had around early 2020 was that 75% of those people who go through Philly jails actually end up being released because a judge decides that there was never enough evidence to hold them indefinitely in jail. And so I think that alone, it is really hard for a single organization to tell enough stories that will pull out the truth of what is happening in our city, across the state, across the country, right? And so we saw this need to really pull ourselves together and actually talk about, the struggles we're facing when it comes to storytelling in a really robust, strategic way. And that actually we could be more effective if we have a shared narrative strategy, and are actually working to build narrative power together. And so we know that part of this work actually requires us to have more intentional space to go through trainings. There is a science and an art to storytelling. So learning the science behind storytelling and the different components of an impactful story, and then the art of just, bringing your own lived experience and emotions into that. There's not a formula fully for how to tell effective stories. We also know that we need to be having a grounded analysis of the power that we do have and what narratives are most pervasive in Philadelphia. And I think what we've kind of arrived at is we have some serious work to do around the narratives around Black masculinity, what it means to be a Black man and how you show up in community as a Black man. And you are not the narratives that have been told about Black men historically, right? That you are dangerous, animalistic, that you're more prone to criminality, that you are less likely to be intellectually intelligent, right? And also different narratives about Black women and girls. I think the conversation around ending mass incarceration has been so hyper-focused on the Black male experience navigating the carceral system, but we're erasing the experiences and the needs of Black trans folks, Black women, and so many other communities, like immigrant communities, getting them to see that their beef is not just with ICE, but it's also with the Philadelphia Police Department and how those two state actors interact and are causing harm and separating families. And also getting white people to see how they've been impacted by mass incarceration and by police killings. This isn't just a Black person issue. It's not just a Black male issue. So how can we tell as many stories in as many formats as possible to really get people to question this idea that police and prisons keep us safe, when in reality, we're spending billions and billions and billions on both policing and prisons. And people don't feel any safer than when the police and prison budget might have been closer to $1 million collectively across the United States, right? And so right now we're in a moment of collective study and recognizing that for the last couple years, we've just kind of been reacting to the terrible stories and harmful narratives that are being pushed out by certain media outlets, certain community leaders and elected officials, right? And now we actually want to tap into our collective imagination. And so I'm really excited about the work ahead, where we're actually going to go through a series of workshops where we can really locate ourselves way into the future and think about that world we're trying to build. And what is the narrative what is the belief that is kind of grounding us in that vision? And what are the stories that we can tell to really get people to share this vision for changing the world? And so right now, we don't really have a concrete abolitionist narrative framework to present to y'all, but let's come back together at PhillyCAM, later in 2023. And I'm really excited to say, this isn't just how we're going to react to harmful narratives we see about Black people, about gun violence in general, but these are the values and the stories that reflect kind of what we believe to be true about humanity, about Philadelphians, about Black youth. So really excited to go through that process with y'all and to strategize about how we can bring more journalists into adopting our narrative framework once we're ready to present it to the world.
Taking you up on that, we're going to come back next year and we're going to do a little follow-up and recap of all of that. But one of the exercises that we do often when we do these community listening sessions is we ask people about the narratives around their neighborhoods. And so I think about like, what's the narrative around North Philly? Like what's the perception? I'm from the Northeast Philly. So people always say very strange things about Northeast Philly that are not true. And so it's interesting when you put a bunch of people in the same city in a room and they're allowed to tell the story of their community. Most of the time, other folk, people in the room are surprised because it's not what they thought it was. And I remember going to Detroit for the first time, for example, and being really surprised that Detroit is very beautiful and it's there's lots of art there and beautiful buildings and organizing and there's just a lot happening. That's not the narrative that you see in national mainstream media. And so that's what we're talking about. Like, what is the dominant narrative about Black people in Philadelphia or about immigrant communities or about your neighborhoods? Those are the things we're trying to think about. And I like to think of us as architects, right? Since we're building these blocks, we're building the foundation for the structure, the narrative structure that's to come. Before we take another break, I want to talk with you, Malav. I see you're in a room, you got books behind you, you're at the university, you're constantly studying. Tell us what you're working on right now and tell us a little about this symposium that we're going to host in February to bring all these ideas together.
Okay, sure. Well, let me first highlight a couple things that you just said and that Aubrey mentioned and Tahid also. I think it highlights for me the importance of doing this type of work in coalition. That there are a lot of deep and longstanding histories and memories and experiences that communities carry, and that we need to facilitate the spaces and the work in coalition to learn about each other's histories. And in fact, to undo that learning, that somehow our histories are separate and side by side, and in many cases competing. That's also part of the narrative, is that our histories of how we live and thrive and imagine a collective future for ourselves in this city depends on some sort of competition between us. And that's not at all the case. And in fact, learning about each other's histories and how we depend on each other also deepens what we mean by building narrative power as well. So that coalitional work, I think, is such an important part of it. It also helps us map out how far-ranging and different our experiences are in different communities of police and different institutions in the city of Philadelphia that serve to discipline and punish, and also do the work of redistributing, disinvesting from certain communities and redistributing resources into other spaces and other kinds of institutions. And that kind of that diversity of what we might call the carceral system requires a lot of different entry points to understand it. And I think the coalitional work that we're trying to build depends on that type of analysis as well. There's also something else that happens here that I just want to kind of underscore in what both Aubrey and Tahid mentioned, which is that narrative power is also about, the ability for individuals and communities to tell their stories and their histories, and for us, our ability to learn from each other. But what we're building when we do that is something that we might call narrative self-determination, the ability for us to be able to tell our stories, and also, and this goes directly back to what Aubrey was saying too, about what kind of world we want to build. So, what kind of positive program for society do we envision ourselves? And so That Safety You Can Feel survey and a number of other projects that are kind of right at the base of the last couple of years of this Shift the Narrative Coalition really starts to tell us that there already is an abolitionist imagination and like a sensibility that exists in far-ranging communities in Philadelphia, and getting to the root of that and building a sense of common history and a vision for the future collectively is all about what we're trying to do with the Shift Narrative Coalition. So the other part of it that Tauhid mentioned is also like, there have been plenty of analyses and audits, certainly of the Philadelphia Inquirer and other newsrooms across the country. We know, and folks in those newsrooms, the managers and the publishers and the board members of these newspapers, they know what is at stake in the reporting that they do or do not do. There has been well-documented and ample evidence all around. I want to highlight the Media 2070 project, for example, that the Free Press, Tauhid, and others have collaborated to author, which documents a long-standing history of journalistic harms and abuses that are baked in structurally into the way newsrooms are organized. This draws on longer standing histories. There's been other moments too, whether it's the 1968 Kerner Commission that already names the ways in which poverty and institutional racism are baked into the narrative of what urban violence and inner city violence looks like. Going back even before that, the 1951 We Charge Genocide document that already names the structural role that media institutions play in perpetuating what we might call narrative condemnation, right? A kind of narrative abandonment. And the structural violences that not only that it reproduces and reflects in its narrative making and reporting, but also the actual power, the political economy of those institutions in upholding that form of violence in society. So we're taking on a lot in our analysis, but that's why it's directly rooted in a history of media as institution in our society and what needs to shift there. So I just want to kind of underscore both what Aubrey and Tauhid were saying, because it's two sides of a kind of dual strategy that we're trying to elaborate with Shift the Narrative. So we're trying to put this together in a lot of different contexts and frameworks. And so one thing that we're organizing is a public convening sometime in early spring of next year, where we can reflect upon what is the work of policing, the function of policing in our society, and what kind of narratives does policing kind of depend upon and uphold, and what kinds of power does it reproduce, and in what ways can we think through the role that media plays in reproducing that kind of narrative power, and where, as Aubrey, you mentioned earlier, where in our communities exist already the nascent and collective forms of narrative power to not only shift the stories and shift the values, but to really underscore and build collectively the ways in which belief and vision and collective imagination already exists in our communities, and that we can start naming the structural impediments to to realizing that vision. So the convening is sort of meant to bring those conversations together across journalists and folks who are working in newsrooms, organizers in the community, media scholars, media makers, to have this sort of far-ranging conversation about what this kind of change looks like at the neighborhood level, in the newsroom, and what we can do to organize across all of these different spaces and stitch together in a kind of coalition the power that we need and the media that we need.
Yeah, and it's so important to put everyone together in the same space, because we're so often siloed. And, I go to a lot of conferences, and usually journalists are not talking to community people, and, scholars are not talking to journalists. And so having everybody together, collaborating, problem solving on these ideas is super important. That's why we put together this coalition. We only have a few minutes left. But I wanted to get your thoughts and your dreams and your hopes about the kind of media system that you envision, right? Like, I think a lot of us do this work because we have our own hopes and dreams for what media could be. And many of us are inspired by our friends working on Media 2070 that have led a lot of this dreaming and visioning work. So, really quick, because I know we can talk about our dreams like in a whole show about this, but Aubrey, I'll go to you first. What's your vision for the future for narratives, media, whatever you desire?
I really want to get rid of this narrative around individual bootstrapping. Like, the only way to live a good life is to work really hard and follow the rules. And if you fail, if you don't have the job you want, if you're struggling to keep the lights on, it's because of your own wrongdoing. As someone who was raised in poverty and constantly in a survival mode, like, and how many people in Philly are living in poverty, like, we really have to combat narratives around that are connected to capitalism and this idea of meritocracy, and that the state has a responsibility to provide for the basic needs, and housing is a basic need, water is a basic need, food is a basic need. And if every single Philadelphian doesn't have that, we're going to continue to see lots of violence in our communities.
Thanks. This is the lightning round. Tahid, I'm going to go to you. What's your vision, your dream for the future?
Yeah, I would love to see these legacy media outlets, kind of disappear. And from the ashes of that, what does community-centered, community-powered, supportive journalism actually look like from the people who are definitely experiencing direct violence from police in the carceral state? I also want to liberate funds from philanthropy, because these news institutions continue to fund these traditional media outlets that are not doing any sort of righteous justice in terms of their reporting. So liberating funds from philanthropy and being able to financially support more organizations and coalitions like these is something that I dream of.
Thanks. Malav?
Right on. Yeah. Well, in the immediate sense, I want to amplify and support struggles that workers in the media industries are waging in newsrooms and other workplaces for better pay, better say, and to transform what those newsrooms look like and the entire kind of structure of media ownership. I think that we are overdue for a vast kind of media cooperative movement. And at the same time, imagining like spaces of media creation, like neighborhood by neighborhood, so that maybe, block by block, there are just spaces that folks can come into and help produce the news as well. So drawing on some like experiments and experiences from, let's say, the Indie Media project 20 years ago, thinking about what that looks like today and building it block by block.
Well, I can tell you what it looks like today. It looks like more PhillyCAMs all over the city. So we don't have enough PhillyCAMs. Shout out to PhillyCAM for helping us with this show, to our executive producer, Sergio Galliano, and the whole People Powered Media Fest highlighting work like this. Thank you all so much for joining the show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. You've just been watching Shifting the Narrative, Organizing to End a Crime Beat. My dream is to end the crime beat and have more people-powered media like PhillyCAM all over the city and all across the country. I hope we can get there with your support. If you like this program and you want to create your own media, or you just want to support people-powered media like this, do visit PhillyCAM's website, phillycam.org, and follow PhillyCAM on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. You can also follow Free Press, Movement Alliance Project, and the Media Inequality and Change Center. It's been a pleasure speaking with all of you this hour, and for all of you watching and listening, thank you so much. That's the end. We'll see you next time.